Hello, and welcome to the integration of relationship-based practices into a PBIS framework, Part 2. I'm Lauren Ivanovich, and I have with me Stephanie Martinez. We will be walking through this chat with you.
One of the things we like to do when we talk about relationship building practices is to model. So here is a question that we're just asking you. It would be something that we could do in a circle or a different practice just to get to know our participants a little bit better. So if you had unlimited funds, where would your dream vacation be? You might just want to pause and think, pause the recording for a second and think about where you would want to go and why you'd want to go there. If we were with you live, we'd have all of our participants share back their responses.
The agenda for today will go through exploration. So we're going to do a quick review of circles and strategies for advanced facilitation of circles, responsive relationship-based practices, and shuttle mediation. And then we'll also look at installation and adoption for the next steps for responsive relationship-based practices within your school or district.
So in this session, there are 4 objectives that we will be covering. By the end of this session, we hope that you know what the 4 parts of a circle are. You're able to identify the common responsive relationship-based practices. You can describe how relationship practices can be used within a PBIS framework. And then what are some next steps you and your school could take to implement some relationship-based practices?
We're going to move on to the first section of the circle review using advanced facilitation techniques.
We like to break relationship practices into 4 types. 1 are effective statements, and effective statements are the language that you use as I statements to tell and describe how someone's behavior makes you feel. It could be positive or negative. The purpose of effective statements is to get the other people to see and have empathy for how their behavior impacts others. Circles are a second type of relationship-based practices. You may have heard of them as called morning meetings. It's a common term for them. But circles can be used class-wide to develop relationships and build those relationships. You could also use them as a teaching aspect, so teaching social, emotional life skills. We could also use it for teaching academics. We can also use circles as a class to solve some class-wide problem issues. So a common issue in our secondary schools are students coming late to class. So we might have a circle when we notice that there's been an increase in students coming to class late. The third type of practice is repairing conferences. So in this instance, there has been someone who's been harmed or multiple people who have been harmed by one person or multiple people. It could be both students involved, it could be students and staff involved, and it could just be staff involved. And in these instances, we're trying to repair the relationship that has been harmed. There's a couple different ways of doing it. At the end of these repairing conferences, there is an action plan that's been developed and agreed upon by those who caused harm and those who were harmed. And then the last one is our reintegration procedures. Reintegration is taking the time to come up with a plan once a student has harmed someone and been removed to integrate them back into the school or classroom with open arms. So it could be as simple as a student who's been removed from the classroom as a result of an office referral. It could be after a student returns from a short-term or long-term suspension, or even when a student is returning back to a homeschool after an alternative placement or residing in DJJ.
As a reminder, circles have a structured process for bringing people together. Helps to really create those relationship-based bonds that we need in order to have relationship-based practices. This also helps us to share and understand our feelings and solve problems. The types on the left in green are those more proactive circles, such as checking in, morning meetings, peacemaking circles, and problem-solving circles. As we move to the right in the blue, those are those more reactive or responsive circles, things like healing and repairing circles.
There are four components of a circle. We like to say that we use these four components so it becomes routine and predictable for students for trauma-informed care, but also that way the students know the four steps that will be used in circles so that eventually students can start to become facilitators of circles. So the four components are either a greeting or a focusing moment. A greeting is the opportunity for us to greet one another and to learn a little bit about one another. It always involves stating individuals' names. Usually we use the greeting when it's a new group of people together who don't know one another, or when a new person joins the group. So for example, it's the second 9 weeks of school. In my homeroom class, we have a new student, Jose, who's been enrolled, and will be a good opportunity to do a greeting. Now, a focusing moment is used when we want to focus our students' attention to what the task is at hand. So for example, they've just come in from class period change, or they just come in from lunch or recess, and maybe they're a little hyped up, and so we want them to calm down and focus on the moment. Or maybe it's a serious topic that we will be doing, so we want them to focus. So an example would be some deep belly breathing or visualization activities. Both of these, the greeting and focusing moments, should be quite short, 2 to 3 minutes at the most. Next, we go to connections or feelings check-in. This is the ability to assess how our students or the participants are feeling that day. So it could be sharing a feeling word. We could give them a scale of 1 to 3. Hold up your fingers on how you're feeling, 1 to 3. And then we could say 1 is, I'm really tired right now. And of course, for secondary students, you need to hold up your pointer finger because that's the number 1. Number 2, it's maybe they are happy to be here, but they're a little unsure about what's going on. And 3, they're really excited. And then they hold their finger up to identify how they're feeling. That also lets the facilitator or the teacher know if there's students, maybe we need to check in later. So you have a student that's normally a 2 or 3, and today they're a 1. So maybe I just want to have a private conversation later with them. Or if I notice all my students are feeling like a 1, I might be changing the activity, which we'll talk about next. So that allows you to kind of see where your students or participants are to assess what type of activity to do in the circle, and also to check in with people later. The next one is the activity. Unlike the first two, which are pretty short and quick, the activity will depend on what you're doing. It could be pretty short if we're doing like a community building activity. It could be a lot longer if we are doing an academic skill, like reviewing for a test, or even doing teaching a social behavioral life skills. So if I'm teaching something like how to accept a compliment, it might take a little bit longer. And then problem solving, I gave the example on the previous slide. We might be solving a problem like kids coming tardy to class. Depending upon what you're doing it for, it will depend on the length of the activity, but it is the bulk of our circle. And then the last part is the closing. The closing is also pretty quick. It just signals to our participants and our students that the circle is coming to a close. That helps with predictability and routine. So it could be letting them know the schedule of what's going on after the circle closes. Dr. Ivanovich, who I work with, she always likes to do a round of applause with his students. I also know a teacher who plays the guitar, and so he learns the popular songs. He sings the verse, and the kids sing along with the chorus. He's also great with yoga, so maybe he teaches them a yoga pose. So there's lots of options there.
When we think about the topography of a circle, what you can see here are realistic things that you should do for a circle. So all people should be in an actual circle. If you can't sit in a circle, maybe you want to stand or be all at the same level. That's what's important, is that we all have equal status. So if one person is not able to stand, then everyone should be sitting at that person's level, whether it's in a chair or on the floor. That includes the facilitator. A advanced facilitation piece here to add is that we hope the designated facilitator is actually the student. This would be something you would work towards. You would teach and reinforce how each of the 4 steps of the circle are done, and then the student would be able to be the person that becomes the facilitator. Perhaps they would help to lead all parts of the circle or one or two parts of the circle. You can practice, and then eventually, hopefully, they would run the circle as well. Those expectations are still there, so hopefully they are tied to your PBIS school-wide expectations and your classroom rules, things like being honest, speaking with respect, and following the structure. Again, a reminder that everyone has the opportunity to participate in our circle. Participation is encouraged, but is always optional. And an additional piece to add as an advanced facilitation is to use a designated talking piece. Sometimes we find that our circles have gotten kind of out of whack, or we might need some refocusing. And a good refocusing piece could be the use of a talking piece. We know that during these times, perhaps we may not want to use an actual physical object, so perhaps you might do an air high five to signal that I'm moving from one person to the next, or you can say I'm going to pass it next, or use the person's name. So I'm going to pass it on to Stephanie.
So as we mentioned in slide 8, that the activity takes up the bulk of a circle. So here are some examples of some different activities that schools have used for circles. So there's some lists under teaching. So these are just examples from schools we've gathered across the state of Florida of how they used a circle for teaching. So you can notice there's examples both for students and for staff. So an example here at the very bottom, they had a new procedure for hallway duty, and staff were inconsistent on how they were performing their hallway duty. So they took the opportunity again to refresh and revisit what that should look like on campus. Then we have some activities here for community building. So here is one at a high school where the students got to describe what their future goals were, what they wanted to do after high school. Gives you an opportunity to get to know the students a little bit better, and then students get to know students a little bit better. And then the last one is problem solving. And in this one, just bringing up one of the examples that is on here, that the fifth graders were having a circle in the classroom to talk about just general classroom behavioral issues and some strategies that could be done to solve that. So in that instance, they weren't pointing out a specific student, but just as a class, we're having problems, students talking out of turn, students out of seat, and then what could be some things that could be done. So again, just some examples of what these may look like.
We're going to move on to the next section of responsive or relationship-based practices.
In this slide, we are showing the different RBPs across the tiers. So if you look on the left-hand side, you have a triangle. It looks just like the ones you see in the PBIS slides for Tier 1 and Tier 2. Tier 1, what we are focusing in on are building and strengthening relationships. And so with that, all students and all staff should be involved in effective statements and circles. So everybody. Just like with PBIS, when we think about Tier 2, not all students will ever participate in Tier 2 RBPs. Just being involved if there has been an incident where they either caused harm or were a recipient of harm and we need to repair that situation. Then we have Tier 3 RBPs. That is when students are removed and we need to do some re-entry or reintegration into the school. That should be just a very small percentage of your students. You'll notice on the right-hand side that the items in green are Tier 1 RBPs. They take less time and resources. And then above, the items listed in black are the continuum of RBP practices that may be put in place at a school for more of our Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports. So again, not all students will need that. Will all schools need all of those practices? The answer is no. It will be based on the need of your school and of your staff. It will also be important to identify what are the resources, which include personnel, to do those practices in place. So you might only pick a couple of them. Some of you may never need.
Now that we've reviewed the continuum of relationship-based practices on the slide before us, we want you to stop and think about what it takes to do responsive RBP. So, which of the following do you think are important for implementing responsive RBP? Shift in mindset away from punishment focused discipline, trained facilitators, interpersonal skills, already established relationships, time, more than one of the above, perhaps multiples, other things. Take a couple of minutes to stop, reflect. You may want to pause this recording and just think about what might be important before implementing responsive RBPs.
So you may be asking yourself, is our school ready for responsive RBP practices? Well, here's a couple things to think about before you start to investigate if the school is ready. The first thing is, have you been implementing some of those proactive RBP practices, and have you seen as a result of that positive relationships between students and staff and staff to staff? Do our staff and students have empathy skills? Are our staff ready to receive input from families and students around discipline policies and procedures? Are we ready as a staff to be okay with agreements that are developed at our responsive RBP practices and support whatever is decided between those parties? Also, does the school have the ability to develop and modify discipline policies and procedures? And if not, who has that ability and who do they need to go to at the district to be able to do it? And then most importantly, do we have the support of our staff on campus to implement RBP practices? Are they willing and supportive of thinking of using RBP as a way to repair relationship after some harm has been caused? It is a mind shift. It's a little bit different than giving consequences when a referral happens, but instead are they really able and willing to look about repairing those relationships?
Here are the 5 R's, or the guiding principles of RBPs. We've focused a lot on the relationship piece. We have to have those relationships before we can have really true, responsive, relationship-based practices occur. So focusing on what are you doing to build those relationships, effective statements, classroom circles, reframing chats, a lot of the things that we covered during RBP chat number 1. Also, we want to think about respect. So providing the voice for the person harmed, improving social behavior of staff and students. The third R is responsibility. So really emphasizing placing the harm rather than the offense and understanding the impact of harm. So that idea of empathy, something that we have to teach before we can get to really implementing some of these responsive RBPs. We want to have that understanding and being taught the ideas of respect, responsibility, and then moving into restoration and reintegration. Again, in order to have restoration, we have to have a relationship to restore, and same for reintegration.
So again, why should we identify if we're actually ready for responsive RBP? Again, I mentioned earlier, there is that mind shift here, and it's not all about giving consequences necessarily for students. Yes, there will be consequences, but some of those consequences could be different than what we traditionally do. So for example, if a student has been disruptive in class and the teacher had to take time out of their day to handle the behavior, then maybe the agreement is that student is going to make up the time that they took away from the teacher and helping the teacher in the classroom as a way to repair that relationship and to repair that lost time. It's a little bit different. It's a different mind shift. We also have to make sure that all parties are willing to take responsibility for their actions. So if it's a student to student, both parties are willing to not only develop that action plan, but they're willing to accept and follow through with the action steps. Same with adult to staff, staff to staff, and the same for staff to students, that they are able to do that. and realizing that those consequences may be identified again from RBP are not like our traditional detention, work detail, phone call home, parent conference. We know that there are some behaviors because of student code of conduct where students will have to be suspended, and we're not saying don't do that. But what we are saying, if you do have to do something like a suspension or in-school suspension, you can also do a responsive RBP in addition to it. So if there was a situation where two students got into a physical fist fight, we had to suspend the students, we still want to repair that harm between the students. So if they had a relationship before the fight, we want to bring them back together to try to repair that relationship to prevent another fight from happening. It also, again, does require all parties involved to be willing to accept the action steps that are developed during that meeting and then following through. So we might need the support of not only the students and the staff at the school and administration, but we also may need to have our families involved. And if that's the case and they need to support it, then they need to be part of those meetings.
Here are some things to consider when you're thinking about preparing to implement responsive RBPs. Time. Time is a really big one. So going back a couple of slides to thinking about that continuum of practices, what time do we realistically have to be able to implement responsive RBPs? We may also need to have trained facilitators with interpersonal skills, and the interpersonal skills are listed below. We want to make sure that our responsive practices are written into our discipline process and procedures and follow a structured process. When we're thinking about preparing to implement responsive RBPs, we want to make sure that we have had buy-in from all of our participants, and we have that all-important big number 1R relationships that have already been formed, so that when we have something that has occurred that we need to repair or respond to, there's already a relationship in place. And then students and really all participants, all staff, all individuals must have that empathy skills. So we may need to really work on teaching those before we can truly implement our responsive RBPs. The last bullet here is really important to remember, that voluntary participation. So anytime we have this, we would hope to encourage responsive RBP participation, but it is always truly voluntary.
In the previous slide, we mentioned the need to have good interpersonal communication skills. This handout, which is attached, is a really good one that gives you the opportunity to look at what the different types of interpersonal communication skills are. And we really encourage you to pause and look at this handout and say, okay, which one of these are my strengths and which ones are the ones that I need to probably work on, and then think about some different things you can do to work on that. So for example, active and attentive listening. If you're a type of person who is, as the person is speaking, you're trying to think, okay, how am I going to respond to this? Then that might be something that you need to work on. Whereas you might be really good at paraphrasing what people are saying. So you've got two students in your office together, you can hear what they're saying and you can summarize and then also then paraphrase what they're saying to make sure that you understand what they're sharing with you.
So we want to think about how we're going to integrate our responsive RBPs into our PBIS existing discipline flowchart. So perhaps you have a discipline flowchart that looks like this, or something similar, or maybe something completely different, whatever works for your school. This is just an idea to give you an example of how to integrate responsive RBPs into your flowchart.
There are a set of 7 standard questions that should be used when doing a repairing chat. Here are the 7 questions listed. Tell me what happened. What were you thinking at the time? What do you think about it now? Who did this affect? What do you need to do about it? How can we make sure that it doesn't happen again? And the emphasis is here is we. It is a decision done together. And then the last one, what can I do to help you? That's because as the facilitator, you should be involved in trying to help repair the harm. You will notice there's not a question in here about why did you do it. We know if we ask most students, why did you do it? You're going to get one of two responses. Oh no, or I didn't do anything. So when we think about the why part, kind of number 1 and 2 kind of get to that. Tell me what happened and what were you thinking at the time. So again, these are the 7 standard questions when going through a pairing chat. All 7 should be asked and all participants should have the opportunity, both those that caused harm and that received harm.
When we're thinking about using a repairing conference, there are 3 parts. So there's the pre-planning meeting, the conference itself, and then the follow-up. The pre-planning meeting we'll go in depth on the next slide about, but the conference itself really follows the same structure of the repairing chat in the previous slide. The follow-up also involves a simple follow-up with each of the parties involved. So now we're going to go into what does that pre-planning meeting look like and how do we prepare our students?
There's some preparation that does need to take place with our students prior to them engaging in responsive RBPs. First and most important is that there needs to be an established relationship between the student and the person or persons who they caused harm to, whether it's additional students or staff members on campus. They also must have the prerequisite skill of having empathy and understanding how their behavior impacted others and caused harm. Now, if we're doing a repairing chat, the students should have already been exposed and know what the chat questions are. Maybe they're posted on the wall. Maybe there's a sheet that has them listed. Maybe they've had the experience of using them before. Now, if it's a conference, there is more planning that needs to take place in preparation. So before even going into the meeting, the student needs to have a one-on-one meeting with a facilitator and have the opportunity to practice just with that facilitator the questions that will be asked, have the opportunity to practice answering the question so they get a feel for the process that will be used during that repairing conference, and they go through that. We also want during that time to have an opportunity to ask them who they would like to participate with them. Maybe if it's the person who caused harm, they want a school counselor or another teacher that they feel will support them during the process. If it's the person who received the harm, they may want the same thing. They might want a friend, a teacher. They may want their family involved. But the most important thing at the very end of that meeting, of that repairing conferences chat, is that it is voluntary and that the students are willing to participate. If at any point in time a student says they do not want to participate, we do not force them and move ahead. What we can do is pause, take some time, and then come back at a later date, whether it's later in the day or another day, and ask them if they now are ready to participate. If they are, then we can move forward. If not, then again, we still don't force a student to participate until they're ready.
Oh, so what happens though if they don't want to participate? You might be asking yourself, this sounds great. We have the capability to do the 3 parts of the conference. However, we have one party who is not interested in participating, or we have multiple parties not interested in participating. What do we do?
You may be asking yourself, well, what is shuttle mediation? Shuttle mediation is an option for a responsive RBP conference when 2 parties are agreeing to an RBP, but maybe they're kind of nervous about being in the same room together. So what happens is the same process as a traditional RBP conference. However, you meet with one person and one party and they answer the questions. Then you take that information to the other party and they answer the questions, and you go back and forth until you have an agreement between both parties about what can be done to repair the harm that was caused.
So you've given them the option of shuttle mediation, and perhaps they still don't want to participate. Then you stop doing the repairing conference, or you stop with the responsive RBP that you've selected. Remember, there is voluntary participation. So if at any point anyone wants to stop doing this, that's what you do. This is not an end-all be-all. It is just another tool in your toolbox. So if RBP is not working for a responsive discipline procedure, then go to something else on your discipline flowchart and your discipline toolbox. This doesn't have to be the only option. And if you have anyone who is not wanting to participate, that means you do need to stop and do something different.
This is a great example of a sample timeline to show a school who is both implementing PBIS at Tier 1 and RBPs. So you can see where they are teaching their expectations and rules, where they're starting with their proactive RBP practices with effective statements and circles, how they are providing that PD to their staff to use those practices. And then at the bottom, you can see where they're starting to integrate in some of those responsive RBP practices later on down the line. So just an example of a sample timeline of what one school did for implementing PBIS, RBP, both proactive and responsive.
So you've gotten a good overview and brief overview of some responsive RBPs and some advanced facilitation. So now what? What are our next steps?
Okay, now that you've learned more about responsive RBP practices, we have some questions to ask first yourself about, are we ready to implement those practices? So asking yourself, do we as a school, myself, the team, and our staff buy into these practices? What do our current practices and policies around discipline look like? And where can these practices, both preventative and reactive or responsive, fit in? Then we need to say, okay, now that we know where we can fit some of these things in, do we have the personnel who have the time and ability to implement these responsive RBP practices? And do they have the time to commit to it? What time are we willing to provide and have the ability to provide to teachers for maybe doing circles in the classroom, teaching effective statements? What time do we have with our staff to introduce these RBP practices? What time do we have for staff, for personnel who will be doing the responsive RBP practices? And when do we want to start? So knowing that timeline of when we want to start will let us know, okay, we need to go back and do some PD first. We need to have those planning pieces in place. We need to make sure our policies and practices around discipline are aligned with RBP. So it kind of lets you know when we can get started based on doing all that pre-work.
You'll want to ask yourselves, does your PBIS team, and does your staff buy in? Do you have philosophical beliefs that align with RBPs? Will everyone on the PBIS and administrative team support the use of RBP practices, specifically responsive as well as proactive? Where does the staff stand on the philosophy of RBPs? And one of the ways that you'll know that is by having them complete the belief survey. So there is a belief survey that we've created for you to use that once you are already implementing proactive pieces of RBP, you can then use the belief survey prior to trying to implement some of the responsive or reactive RBPs. So we'd hope that you would use the belief survey in order to know where your staff stand on RBPs.
Let's dive a little bit deeper into some questions around our current practices and policies around discipline. So when we think about our preventative RBP practices, again, are we currently teaching behavioral, social, and life skills? If so, what is the frequency, and do all of our staff do it? Then the other most important one is, what do those relationships look like between our students to students and staff to students? Because remember, in order to do responsive RBP, we have to have good relationships between our students and good relationships between staff and students. Then what we need to think about too is, okay, maybe we are ready, our data and our support using responsive practices. So then we want to go back really and look at our data and say, okay, what are the most common administrative decisions used? Are there instances for those behaviors would it be good to do an RBP? What type of behaviors lend itself to using an RBP practice? Do we have consistency among staff across campus with what behaviors are referred to the office? Do we have consistency among administration in regards to the consequences given for those behaviors? And then do we see some of that consistency across subgroups? So do we see similarities and patterns of behavior and responses or consequences given for students with disabilities, students that are of different races and ethnicities, students of different genders? So some things to think about.
What time are we willing to provide? So one of the big questions that you'll want to ask yourselves before implementing responsive RBPs is, what time do we have to provide professional development to the staff? Who on staff needs professional development? Do we have the ability to do repairing conferences as needed? So at any time when they come up, do we have the staff and the time to be able to stop everything else and go ahead and do a repairing conference as deemed appropriate by the administrator, using that, hopefully using that discipline flow chart as integrated? Do we have the ability to do something like a reintegration every time the student returns from out of class, out of school suspension, alternative learning center, DJJ? What is that going to look like? And what time are we willing to provide? You don't have to do all of these things, but you do need to lay out what you're able to do and how you're going to do that.
Okay, now that we've reviewed this presentation, maybe we've shared it with our PBIS team, we've shared it with the administrators on our campus, we know that we have really good, strong preventative RBP practices put in place. We've got students who have empathy for one another. We've got staff who have empathy for one another. We have good, positive relationships between our students and our staff for the most part. What do we do next to put those responsive RBPs in place? Well, we have a belief survey that you can request from the FLPBIS project. Once you receive that survey, and if the results show that there is consistency amongst your staff to move forward, then we will request that your administrator contact your district coordinator to start to implement those responsive RBPs. Now remember, you must have received training and had good solid foundations of preventative, so effective statements and circles, before we'll move you on to responsive RBPs. Remember, this is just a brief recording of a preview or an overview of RBP practices. This is not our full and intensive training to say that you've been trained. On the next slide, if you need information about to contact us, that will be on the next slide.
Thank you for joining us for the part 2 of responsive RBPs in PBIS chat. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to contact us on our Florida PBIS website. Here's listed also our Facebook, our Twitter, and our YouTube page. Thanks, and have a great rest of your day.